Did you actually serve my mother spoiled food because she can't see? The woman in the Navy uniform smirked. That's what your kind deserves anyway. You need to respect black people. And what exactly are you going to do about it, little girl? You're terminated. And I promise you, no airline in this country will touch your resume after today. The words hung in the pressurized air of the first-class cabin like a blade suspended by thread. 37,000 feet above Kansas, time seemed to freeze. Every passenger turned. Coffee cups paused midway to lips. Laptops went dark as attention shifted to a 10-year-old black girl standing in the aisle, her hands steady at her sides, her voice calm as still water before a storm. The flight attendant laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the cream-colored walls. She glanced around as if inviting the other passengers to share in the absurdity of a child threatening an adult. But the faces staring back offered no alliance, only shock, only the dawning realization that something profound was unfolding. What happened in the next 72 seconds would end one woman's career, transform an entire industry's training protocols, and prove that power doesn't always announce itself with credentials or volume. Sometimes it arrives in a child's unwavering gaze. Before we go deeper into this case, take a second and hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know where you're watching from. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. The girl's name was Harper Renee Monroe. She stood beside seat 2A, where her mother sat with dark glasses covering eyes that no longer processed light. Her mother, Dr. Victoria Monroe, had been absolutely still since the confrontation began, her fingers gripping the armrest with enough force to blanch her knuckles white. The flight attendant, her name tag read Bethany Walters, crossed her arms over her chest. "Sweetie, I think you've been watching too much television. This is the real world. Adults are talking." Harper didn't blink, didn't raise her voice, didn't stamp her feet or cry or do any of the things you'd expect from a child being dismissed so condescendingly. Instead, she reached into the small leather purse hanging from her shoulder and pulled out her phone. Not a child's toy. A real iPhone with a platinum case that caught the overhead lights. Her thumbs moved across the screen with practiced precision. Around them, the energy in the cabin shifted. The businessman in seat 3C abandoned his spreadsheet completely. The woman across the aisle lowered her medical journal. Even the other flight attendants had emerged from the galley, drawn by the strange tension crackling through the air like static before lightning. Bethany turned to her colleague, a younger woman named Carla, who stood frozen by the emergency exit. "Can you believe these entitled passengers?" Bethany muttered, loud enough for half the cabin. Oh, to hear. They buy a first-class ticket and think they own the whole damn plane. Especially these people, always demanding special treatment. The casual racism of that phrase, these people, sent a visible ripple through the watching passengers. What had been curiosity was hardening into something else, something uncomfortable, something close to anger. What Bethany Walters didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that her entire professional life was about to collapse. Because the little girl she was dismissing wasn't just any passenger, and the blind woman in seat 2A wasn't just another traveler flying first class. In fact, the next 3 minutes would prove that sometimes the people you underestimate most are precisely the ones who hold your fate in their hands. Harper finished typing and looked up. Her eyes, her father's eyes, deep brown and unwavering, met Bethany's with an intensity that made the flight attendant falter for the first time. "I've notified the appropriate parties," Harper said simply. "They'll be contacting you shortly." Bethany's smirk widened, but there was something forced about it now. something uncertain. "Oh, I'm sure they will. Did you text your daddy to come save you?" The cruelty of that comment landed like a physical blow. Victoria Monroe's entire body tensed. Several passengers audibly gasped. Even Carla, the other flight attendant, looked away in embarrassment. But what none of them knew, what would only become clear in the most devastating way, was that 4 rows back, a man named Robert Chen was experiencing the worst moment of his corporate career. Chen was the regional vice president of Skyline Airways, the carrier whose logo decorated the bulkhead in front of them. He'd been reviewing quarterly reports on his laptop when the confrontation began. He'd been only half listening, distracted by revenue projections and fuel cost analyses. But when he heard that child's voice, steady, clear, absolutely certain, something made him look up. And when his phone buzzed with an encrypted message, he felt his stomach drop through the floor of the aircraft. The message had come through his executive emergency channel, the one reserved for crises, the one that only 3 people in the entire company had access to. It contained 4 words that would haunt him for months. Handle this. Immediately. VM. Robert Chen's hand started to shake, because he knew exactly who VM was. Everyone in the aviation industry knew. Victoria Monroe, the woman who had built Monroe Regional Airlines from a single charter plane into a network that now served 18 states. The woman who'd been featured on the cover of Fortune magazine 3 years ago. The woman who disappeared from public life after her husband's death. The woman, he now realized with mounting horror, who was sitting in seat 2A of his airline, being insulted by one of his flight attendants. His eyes moved to the little girl still, standing in the aisle, and the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Harper Monroe, the daughter, the heir to a fortune estimated at north of $3 billion. The child his flight attendant had just mocked and dismissed. Robert Chen closed his laptop with trembling hands and stood up. To understand why this moment felt like watching a building implode in slow motion, we need to step back 5 weeks earlier. To a medical office in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina, where Victoria Monroe sat across from her ophthalmologist in a room that smelled of antiseptic and possibility. "Victoria," Dr. Raymond Hayes said gently, "we've been discussing this surgery for almost 4 years now. The corneal transplant can restore your vision, but the viability window is closing. If we wait much longer, the damage may become irreversible." Victoria's fingers traced the edge of the medical folder in her lap, a habit she'd developed since losing her sight. The braille embossing on her watch told her it was 3:47 in the afternoon. Outside the window she couldn't see. Charlotte's autumn afternoon was fading into evening. For 4 years she'd postponed this surgery. For 4 years she'd told herself she wasn't ready. But the truth was more complicated than medical readiness. The truth was that 4 years ago Victoria Monroe had been unstoppable. She'd built Monroe Regional Airlines from nothing. She'd started with a single Cessna charter service operating out of a regional airport in Tennessee, and transformed it into a sophisticated network of commuter routes connecting the Southeast. She'd been the first black woman to own a regional airline. Forbes had called her the most innovative mind in regional aviation. She'd lectured at Harvard Business School. She'd been living proof that the American dream still existed, still burned bright for those brave enough to chase it. And then, on a gray Tuesday morning in November, everything shattered. Her husband, Captain James Monroe, had been piloting a routine maintenance check flight. A hydraulic failure caused the aircraft to veer off the runway during emergency landing procedures. The fire that followed killed him before the rescue teams could reach the wreckage. Victoria had been in the control tower, listening on the radio. She'd heard his last transmission. She'd heard him fighting to save the aircraft. She'd heard the moment the transmission cut to static. The explosion that took his life also sent debris through the tower's observation windows, Victoria had been standing right there. The glass had torn through her corneas, leaving her in a darkness that felt like a physical weight pressing on her chest every morning when she woke. In the months that followed, grief consumed everything. The woman who'd commanded boardrooms and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts found herself unable to leave her bedroom. The airline that had been her life's work became unbearable, a monument to everything she'd built with James and everything she'd lost when he died. So she'd made a decision that shocked the entire business community. She sold it. Monroe Regional Airlines was purchased by Skyline Airways for $840 million. The deal made headlines. Industry analysts called it the end of an era. But Victoria couldn't bear to step foot in another airport, couldn't bear to smell jet fuel or hear the whine of turbines without seeing James's face, hearing his laugh, remembering the dreams they'd built together. She'd retreated into a darkness that was both literal and metaphorical, living in a penthouse in Charlotte with her daughter and a rotating staff of caretakers. She'd withdrawn from public life completely. For 4 years she'd been a ghost, a memory, a cautionary tale about how quickly success could turn to ash. But Harper, brilliant, observant, impossibly mature Harper, had never stopped believing in her mother's strength. "Mom," Harper had said 3 months earlier, sitting cross-legged on her mother's bed while autumn rain drummed against the windows. "Dr. Hayes says the surgery has a 94% success rate. Those are really good odds." Victoria had smiled without looking up from the braille reader in her hands. "Harper, sweetheart, we've talked about this." "We've talked about you being scared," Harper interrupted. Her voice wasn't accusatory, just factual. "We've talked about you not feeling ready, but we haven't talked about what happens if you wait too long and you never get another chance." That had stopped Victoria cold. "You're 10 years old," Victoria had said quietly. "When did you get so wise?" "I had good teachers," Harper had replied, and Victoria heard her father in that response, James's steady logic, his refusal to let fear make decisions. So Victoria had finally agreed. The surgery was scheduled for early December, but before the procedure, Dr. Hayes had recommended something else, a trip, a chance to practice independence without sight, a chance to prove to herself that she could still navigate the world. "Take Harper somewhere," Dr. Hayes had suggested, "somewhere meaningful. Let yourself be vulnerable again. Let yourself trust the world again." Victoria had chosen Seattle. James had proposed to her in Seattle on a rainy November evening beneath the Space Needle. It felt right to return there before attempting to reclaim her sight. A closing of one circle before opening another. They'd booked first-class tickets on Skyline Airways, the same company that now owned her former airline. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria. She'd be flying on planes she used to own, managed by executives who'd once reported to her, served by crews she'd once hired. But she'd thought it would be fine. She'd thought the anonymity of her blindness would protect her. She'd thought 4 years was long enough for people to forget. She'd been wrong. The flight from Charlotte to Seattle had been uneventful for the first 90 minutes. Harper had settled her mother into seat 2A with practiced efficiency, adjusting the armrest, explaining the location of the tray table and air vents, describing the cabin layout in precise detail. Victoria had relaxed slightly. The familiar sounds of an aircraft had triggered memories both painful and comforting. She'd designed the passenger experience for her airline with obsessive attention to detail. The texture of the upholstery, the ambient lighting, the specific curvature of the seats. Being in a first-class cabin felt like visiting a house she'd once lived in, now occupied by strangers. Harper had been reading a biography of Mae Jemison, occasionally sharing interesting facts with her mother. Victoria had been listening with half her attention, while the other half wandered through memories of James, of the life they'd built, of the future they'd planned. And then the meal service began. Bethany Walters had approached their row with a cart. Victoria had heard the rattle of silverware, smelled the aroma of whatever passed for first-class cuisine these days. "What would you like for lunch?" Bethany had asked, her voice professionally neutral. Harper had started to answer for her mother, but Victoria had gently touched her daughter's arm. "I can order for myself, sweetheart." Then, to the flight attendant, "What are the options?" There had been a pause, a beat of silence that lasted just slightly too long. "We have chicken marsala or vegetarian lasagna," Bethany had said, and Victoria had heard something in her tone, something dismissive, something cold. "I'll have the chicken, please," Victoria had said. The meal had arrived. Harper had discreetly described the plate's layout for her mother. Chicken at 6 o'clock, vegetables at 3, roll at 9. Victoria had taken her first bite and immediately knew something was wrong. The chicken had a sour, fermented taste. The texture was wrong, not the firm consistency of properly cooked poultry, but something soft and slightly slimy. The smell, now that she was paying attention, had an off note beneath the marsala sauce. Victoria had set down her fork carefully. Her stomach had churned with nausea, but more than that, with a creeping suspicion that made her skin prickle with cold awareness. "Harper," she'd said quietly, "can you look at my meal, please?" Harper had leaned over. Victoria had heard her daughter's sharp intake of breath. "Mom," Harper had whispered, "this chicken is gray, like actually gray. And there's green stuff on the vegetables that I don't think is supposed to be there." Victoria's hands had tightened on the armrests. "Are you certain?" "I'm looking at it right now. Mom, this food is spoiled." The words had landed with the weight of confirmation Victoria had hoped wouldn't come, because spoiled food on an aircraft didn't happen by accident. Airlines maintained strict cold chain protocols. Temperature, controls, quality checks. The likelihood of spoiled food making it onto a service cart, especially in first class, was astronomically low, unless someone had deliberately served it. Victoria's mind had raced through the possibilities, desperately seeking an innocent explanation, a mistake, a system failure, anything but the ugly truth that was beginning to crystallize in her thoughts. "Excuse me," Harper had said, her voice carrying the controlled politeness Victoria had taught her. "I think there's a problem with my mother's meal." Bethany had returned to their row. "Is something wrong?" "This food is spoiled," Harper had said clearly. "The chicken is discolored, and the vegetables have mold." There had been another pause, and then Bethany had laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not an apologetic laugh, a dismissive, cruel laugh that made Victoria's blood run cold. "I'm sure it's fine," Bethany had said. "It's the same meal everyone else is eating." "Then why does my mother's look different than everyone else's?" Harper had pressed. "Look, kid, if your mother doesn't like the meal, she doesn't have to eat it. But I'm not getting her another one. The galley's already been secured." Victoria had felt her daughter tense beside her, had felt the anger radiating from Harper's small frame. And she'd done what she'd been doing for 4 years. She'd tried to smooth it over, to avoid conflict, to stay invisible. "It's fine, Harper," Victoria had said softly. "I'm not that hungry anyway." But Harper hadn't moved, hadn't backed down. "Ma'am," Harper had said, and Victoria had heard the steel in her daughter's voice, "you served my mother spoiled food. I'd like to speak to the head flight attendant, please." "The head flight attendant is busy," Bethany had said sharply. "And like I said, the meal is fine. Maybe your mother's just being difficult." And that's when it had happened. That's when everything had changed. Because Victoria had heard what Bethany had said under her breath as she started to walk away. The flight attendant had thought she'd spoken quietly enough that only her colleague would hear. But Victoria's other senses had sharpened in the years since losing her sight. Her hearing had become preternaturally acute. She'd heard every word. Blind people shouldn't fly first class anyway. They can't even appreciate it. The words had hit Victoria like a physical blow. But before she could react, before she could process the casual cruelty of that statement, Harper had stood up. "Excuse me," Harper had said, her voice cutting through the cabin noise with crystal clarity. "Can you repeat what you just said?" Bethany had turned back, her face arranged in false innocence. "I didn't say anything. You said blind people shouldn't fly first class. You said my mother can't appreciate it." The cabin had gone absolutely silent. Every conversation had stopped. Every passenger was now watching this confrontation between a 10-year-old girl and a grown woman in uniform. Bethany's face had flushed red. "I think you misheard." "I didn't mishear anything," Harper had said. "And neither did my mother. She's blind, not deaf. You served her rotten food because you thought she wouldn't notice. And then you insulted her because you think she doesn't belong in first class." Victoria had reached for her daughter's hand, wanting to pull her back, to end this before it escalated. But Harper had gently squeezed her mother's fingers, a silent message that said, "Trust me, I've got this." "Little girl," Bethany had said, her voice now openly hostile, "you need to sit down and be quiet. You're disturbing the other passengers." "I'm disturbing them?" Harper's voice had risen slightly, not with childish tantrum, but with genuine incredulity. "You're the one who served my mother spoiled food and then made racist comments, and I'm the problem?" The word racist had hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. "I am not a racist," Bethany had hissed. "How dare you?" "Then why did you serve my mother different food than everyone else?" Harper had interrupted. "Why did you laugh when I told you it was spoiled? Why did you say these people earlier? Why did you assume we don't deserve to be here?" Every question had landed with prosecutorial precision. Victoria had felt a strange mixture of pride and terror coursing through her veins. Her daughter, her baby girl, was fighting a battle Victoria had spent 4 years avoiding, and she was winning. "You know what?" Bethany had said, her professionalism completely abandoned now. "I don't have to stand here and take this from some entitled kid who thinks she can throw accusations around just because Mommy bought her a fancy ticket." "My mother didn't buy these tickets," Harper had said quietly. "She owns the planes." The statement had been delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that it took several seconds for the full meaning to register. When it did, Bethany's face had gone from red to pale in an instant. "What did you just say?" "My mother is Dr. Victoria Monroe," Harper had continued, her voice steady as bedrock. "She founded Monroe Regional Airlines. She sold it to Skyline Airways 4 years ago. These aircraft? She designed the passenger experience. The seat you're standing next to? She chose the fabric. The service protocols you're supposed to be following. She wrote them." Victoria had wanted to sink through the floor. She'd spent 4 years hiding from her past, and now her daughter was announcing it to an entire cabin of strangers. But Harper hadn't finished. "And I'm Harper Monroe. My trust fund is managed by the same investment firm that handles Skyline's pension program. The attorney who reviews my family's contracts, he's also on Skyline's board of directors. So when I said you're going to be fired, I wasn't making an empty threat. I was stating a fact." The cabin had erupted in whispers. Passengers were pulling out their phones, presumably searching for Victoria Monroe, confirming Harper's claims. The other flight attendants had gone rigid with shock. And Bethany Walters had made the worst decision of her life. She'd laughed again. "This is ridiculous," she'd said, looking around at the other passengers as if inviting them to join her in dismissing this absurd claim. "You expect me to believe that some kid has the power to get me fired? I've been with this airline for 12 years. I have seniority. I have union protection. You can't do anything to me." That's when Harper had looked at her with an expression that was somehow both pitying and absolutely merciless. "Did you serve my mother rotten food? Because she's blind?" Harper had asked, her voice carrying through the entire cabin. "That's what people like you eat anyway," Bethany had sneered, the mask finally completely off, the ugly truth beneath fully exposed. "You will respect black people," Harper had said each word. Deliberate and clear. Or else what? And that's when Harper had delivered the line that would become legendary in aviation circles, that would be quoted in industry publications and training seminars for years to come. "You're fired, and no airline will ever hire you again." Before we continue, take a second and share your thoughts so far on this story below. I read every single one. If you were Harper's mother in that moment, would you have stopped your daughter or let her fight? Drop your answer in the comments. The man who stood up from seat 6C looked like he was walking to his own execution. Robert Chen was 53 years old. He'd worked in aviation for 30 years, climbing from gate agent to regional vice president through a combination of competence, political savvy, and genuine dedication to the industry. He loved flying. He loved the logistics of it, the complexity, the way thousands of moving parts had to synchronize perfectly to get 300 people from point A to point B. But in this moment, he would have given anything to be anywhere else. He'd confirmed Harper's identity with 3 quick phone searches. Dr. Victoria Monroe. Net worth estimated at $2.8 billion. Sold Monroe Regional to Skyline for $840 million in cash and stock. Current major shareholder in Skyline Airways. Board member inactive with voting rights. The child hadn't been exaggerating. If anything, she'd understated her family's position. And one of his flight attendants had just called this woman "people like you" and served her spoiled food. Robert's career was flashing before his eyes as he approached row 2. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I'm Robert Chen, Regional Vice President for Skyline Airways. I'm deeply, profoundly sorry for what just occurred. This is completely unacceptable, and I assure you it will be addressed immediately and comprehensively." Victoria had turned toward his voice, her dark glasses reflecting the cabin. Lights. "Mr. Chen," she'd said quietly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," Harper had interrupted, still standing in the aisle, still radiating that terrifying calm. "Your flight attendant served my mother rotten food, made racist comments, and insulted her disability. Those are facts. The only question is what you're going to do about it." Robert had felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the climate-controlled cabin. "Of course, absolutely. Ms. Walters will be removed from duty immediately and suspended pending a full investigation. We'll be filing a formal incident report, and I'll personally ensure that appropriate disciplinary action is taken." Suspended? Harper had tilted her head slightly, and Robert had felt his stomach drop further. "Mr. Chen, I don't think you understand. I said she's fired, not suspended. Fired, terminated, removed from employment." "Harper," Victoria had said softly, her hand reaching for her. Daughter's arm. "Let's just—" "Mom," Harper had said, and there was steel in her voice that made Victoria's protest die in her throat. "No, we're not doing this. We're not smoothing it over. We're not making this easier for them. She didn't just insult you. She insulted everyone who looks like us. Everyone who's ever been treated like they don't belong. Everyone who's ever been served rotten food, literally or figuratively, and told to just accept it and be grateful." The cabin was so quiet you could hear the air circulation system humming. Robert Chen had been in aviation long enough to recognize when he was standing on the deck of a sinking ship. "Ms. Monroe," he'd said directly to Harper, acknowledging the power dynamic he'd initially failed to recognize. "You're absolutely right. Ms. Walters will be terminated, not suspended. She'll be escorted off this aircraft when we land in Denver for our connection, and security will ensure she leaves the airport immediately. Her employment with Skyline Airways is over as of this moment." Bethany Walters had been standing frozen during this entire exchange, her face cycling through disbelief, anger, and now, finally, fear. "You can't just fire me," she'd protested. "I have rights. I have union representation." Robert had turned to her with an expression that would have frozen gasoline. "Ms. Walters, I strongly suggest you stop talking and proceed to the rear galley immediately. Every word you've spoken in the last 10 minutes has been witnessed by 47 passengers, many of whom are recording this interaction. The union will not protect you from documented discrimination and deliberate service sabotage." "Service sabotage?" Bethany's voice had climbed toward hysteria. "I didn't sabotage anything." "You deliberately served a disabled passenger spoiled food," Robert had said, his voice sharp as broken glass. "That's not just discrimination. In aviation, that's a potential safety violation. If Ms. Monroe had consumed that meal and become ill, it could have constituted a medical emergency at altitude. You're not just terminated from employment. You may be facing federal charges." The blood had drained from Bethany's face. I didn't." "You didn't what?" Harper had asked, her voice quiet but cutting. "You didn't mean it? You didn't think we'd notice? You didn't expect consequences?" Bethany had looked around the cabin, perhaps hoping to find sympathy or support, but the faces staring back at her offered nothing but judgment. The businessman in 3C was shaking his head in disgust. The woman with the medical journal was openly glaring. Even her fellow flight attendants had stepped away, creating physical distance from the catastrophe she'd created. "Please proceed to the rear galley, Miss Walters," Robert had said firmly. "Now." Bethany had walked down the aisle like a woman sleepwalking through a nightmare. Every passenger had watched her pass. Some had pulled out their phones to photograph or record her. The shame of that walk would haunt her for years. After she'd disappeared into the rear of the aircraft, Robert had turned back to Victoria and Harper. "Ms. Monroe, I cannot adequately express how sorry I am. This is beyond unacceptable, beyond anything I've experienced in 3 decades in this industry." Victoria had been quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but edged with something that might have been exhaustion or grief or both. "Mr. Chen, I built an airline on the principle that every passenger deserves dignity, not just first-class passengers, not just able-bodied passengers, every single person who trusts us with their safety and their journey. What happened today suggests the principle didn't survive the sale." The words had landed like an indictment. Robert had flinched as if physically struck. "You're right," he'd said quietly. "And I promise you, this will be addressed at every level of the organization. Training protocols, hiring practices, accountability measures. We'll do better. We have to do better." Harper had studied him with those 2 intelligent eyes. "Words are easy, Mr. Chen. My mother taught me to judge people by their actions, not their promises." "Then judge me by what happens next," Robert had replied. "Starting with this. The meal service will be completely redone for you and your daughter. I'll be personally reviewing the galley inventory to ensure every item is fresh and properly stored. And when we land in Denver, I'll have my assistant arrange for upgraded accommodation and ground transportation for your connection to Seattle. I know it doesn't make up for what happened, but it's a start." Victoria had shaken her head. "I don't want compensation, Mr. Chen. I want change. Real change, the kind that ensures no other black passenger, has to wonder if they're being served spoiled food because someone decided they don't, deserve better. You'll have it, Robert had said. I give you my word. Harper had pulled out her phone again. I'm going to hold you to that. And Mr. Chen? I meant what I said about Mrs. Walters. Her name needs to be flagged in every airline database. She shouldn't be able to transfer to another carrier and do this to someone else. Robert had nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what was being asked. The industry maintains a shared database for terminated employees with cause. Discrimination and safety violations are permanent flags. She won't fly for any commercial carrier again. Good, Harper had said simply. The rest of the flight had passed in a strange, tense calm. Robert Chen had personally overseen the preparation of fresh meals for Victoria and Harper, explaining each dish in detail, offering to taste everything first to prove its quality. The gesture had been awkward but sincere. Other passengers had approached when the seatbelt sign was off, offering quiet words of support to Victoria and admiration to Harper. The businessman from 3C had handed Harper his business card, telling her that when she was ready to enter the workforce, she had a job waiting at his consulting firm. The woman with the medical journal had revealed she was a civil rights attorney and offered her services pro bono if Victoria decided to pursue legal action. But Victoria hadn't wanted lawsuits or publicity. She just wanted to get to Seattle, to visit the place where James had proposed, to find some kind of closure before the surgery that might restore her sight. Harper, however, had different plans. As the plane descended toward Denver for their connection, Harper had typed a lengthy email on her phone. She'd written with the precision of someone much older, laying out everything that had occurred in clinical detail. She'd attached photos of the spoiled meal. She'd included the names of witnesses willing to provide statements. She'd documented every word of Bethany Walters' racist comments. And then she'd sent it to 7 different recipients: Skyline Airways CEO, the FAA's discrimination hotline, 3 major aviation industry publications, and 2 civil rights organizations that monitored airline industry practices. Harper, Victoria had said when her daughter explained what she'd done, you're going to create a media firestorm. Good, Harper had replied. The only way to change systems is to expose them. You taught me that, Mom. You said that when you were building the airline, you had to shine light on every broken practice, every outdated assumption, every person who said women couldn't run airlines, or black entrepreneurs couldn't compete with legacy carriers. You didn't hide from attention then. Why should we hide now? Victoria had been silent for a long time, and then she'd started to cry, quiet tears that slipped beneath her dark glasses and tracked down her cheeks. Baby, she'd whispered, when did you grow up? I had a good teacher, Harper had said, taking her mother's hand. You just forgot how strong you were. I'm just reminding you. The email that Harper sent would eventually reach 47 different journalists, bloggers, and industry analysts. The story would break 18 hours later on 3 major news platforms simultaneously. Within 48 hours, it would be trending on social media under the hashtag #RespectinTheSkies. But the real earthquake would begin when a video surfaced. The passenger in seat 4B, a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Webb, had been recording audio for a podcast about business travel when the confrontation began. When he'd realized what was happening, he'd activated his phone's video camera and captured everything from the moment Harper stood up until Bethany Walters walked to the back of the plane, in shame. The video was 8 minutes and 43 seconds long. It was damning. It was clear. It was undeniable. Webb had initially hesitated to post it. worried about the ethics of filming a child without parental consent. But when the story broke and Skyline Airways issued a carefully worded statement that downplayed the incident as a misunderstanding that has been resolved internally, he decided the public needed to see the truth. He'd posted the video at 11:37 p.m. Eastern Time on a Thursday night. By Friday morning, it had been viewed 4 million times. By Friday afternoon, it was being discussed on every major news network. By Friday evening, Skyline Airways stock had dropped 3%, and their customer service lines were so overwhelmed they'd crashed twice. The video showed everything: Bethany's sneering dismissal, Harper's composed confrontation, the phrase "people like you" captured with perfect audio clarity, the moment when Harper revealed her mother's identity, Robert Chen's panicked intervention, and most devastatingly, Bethany's final sneered comment, "That's what people like you eat anyway." There was no spin that could soften that. No PR strategy that could make it acceptable. The racism was naked and undeniable. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Civil rights organizations issued statements praising Harper's courage and demanding industry-wide reforms. Disability advocates highlighted the intersection of ableism and racism in Bethany's actions. Other airline employees, current and former, began sharing their own stories of discrimination they'd witnessed or experienced. And then the politicians got involved. Senator Janice Washington of North Carolina, who chaired the Commerce Committee's Aviation Subcommittee, called for immediate congressional hearings on discrimination in the airline industry. She demanded that the FAA implement mandatory anti-discrimination training for all flight crews and create a passenger Bill of Rights specifically addressing disability access and racial equity. "This isn't just about one flight attendant," Senator Washington declared in a press conference that was broadcast live across cable news. "This is about systemic failures that allow this kind of behavior to persist. We've seen it in how airlines treat passengers who don't speak English. We've seen it in how they handle religious accommodations. We've seen it in the subtle and not-so-subtle ways they make people feel unwelcome. It's time for real change, not just corporate apologies." Skyline Airways CEO Thomas Brennan was forced to make a public statement from the company's Atlanta headquarters. Standing before a backdrop of microphones and camera lights, he looked like a man facing a firing squad. "What happened on Flight 2847 was inexcusable," Brennan said, his voice tight with controlled anger, though whether he was angry at Bethany Walters or at the PR nightmare she'd created was unclear. "Ms. Walters has been terminated from employment and will not work in the aviation industry again. We are implementing immediate policy changes, including mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, enhanced quality control protocols for meal service, and the creation of a passenger advocacy office to handle discrimination complaints." It was a comprehensive response, crafted by a team of crisis management consultants working around the clock. It hit all the right notes. It promised all the right things. But Harper Monroe, watching the press conference from her hotel room in Seattle, knew better than to trust corporate promises without enforcement mechanisms. Before we go deeper, I would love to hear your point of view. Tell me what part hit you the hardest in the story and share your thoughts in the comments. When you think about Harper standing up to that flight attendant, what does that moment mean to you? The real transformation began not with policy memos or press releases, but with a phone call. 3 days after the video went viral, Victoria's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she hadn't seen in 4 years. The direct line to the FAA's Office of Civil Rights. "Dr. Monroe," said the voice on the other end, "this is Elizabeth Chen from the FAA's Civil Rights Division. We've been reviewing the incident on Skyline Flight 2847, and we'd like to invite you to participate in a working group we're forming to address discrimination in commercial aviation." Victoria had been standing at the window of her Seattle hotel room, looking out at a view she couldn't see. Rain was falling. She could hear it against the glass. could smell the petrichor drifting through the slightly open window. James had proposed on a rainy night. The memory felt both close and impossibly distant. "Ms. Chen," Victoria had said carefully, "I'm not sure what I could contribute. I've been out of the industry for 4 years." "Dr. Monroe, you built one of the most successful regional carriers in the country, with some of the industry's best passenger satisfaction scores and lowest discrimination, complaint rates. Your training protocols and service standards were studied in business schools. You know better than anyone how to build systems that prioritize dignity alongside efficiency." Victoria had been quiet, feeling the weight of her past pressing against the walls she'd built around it. "Besides," Elizabeth Chen had continued, "your daughter has made it very clear that she expects real change, not performative gestures. And frankly, Dr. Monroe, she's right. We need people who actually understand both the business and the moral imperatives involved. We need you." Harper had been sitting on the hotel bed, listening to her mother's side of the conversation. When Victoria had hung up after promising to consider the offer, Harper had spoken with the simple directness that cut through all of Victoria's carefully constructed defenses. "You should do it, Mom. This is what you were meant for. This is what Daddy would want." The mention of James had made Victoria's breath catch. "Harper, I don't know if I can—" "You can," Harper had said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know. You just forgot for a while. But I didn't forget. I've been watching you this whole trip. Even without being able to see, you navigate better than most people. You know exactly where everything is. You read situations perfectly. You understand people. The only thing holding you back is fear." "I'm scared," Victoria had admitted, the words feeling like confession. "I know," Harper had said gently, "but being scared doesn't mean you can't do it. Being scared just means it matters." 2 weeks later, Victoria Monroe underwent the corneal transplant surgery that Dr. Hayes had been recommending for years. The procedure took 6 hours. The recovery required another month of careful monitoring and gradual exposure to light. But when the bandages finally came off and Victoria opened her eyes to see her daughter's face for the first time in 4 years, she wept with a joy so profound it felt like being born again. "You look just like your father," Victoria had whispered, her fingers tracing Harper's cheekbones, her nose, her smile. "And you look exactly how I remember," Harper had replied, her own eyes bright with tears. But there was work to do, and Victoria Monroe, her sight restored and her purpose rediscovered, was ready to do it. The FAA's Working Group on Aviation Discrimination met for the first time in a conference room in Washington, D.C., on a cold January morning. 23 people sat around a massive table: airline executives, disability advocates, civil rights attorneys, pilots, flight attendants, and passengers who'd experienced discrimination firsthand. And at the head of the table, wearing a charcoal suit and her signature pearl earrings, sat Dr. Victoria Monroe. "Thank you all for being here," she'd begun, her voice steady and clear. 4 years ago, I left this industry because I couldn't bear to be part of it anymore. But my daughter reminded me that walking away from broken systems doesn't fix them. So we're here to do the hard work of actually fixing things. Over the next 6 months, the working group would draft comprehensive recommendations that would reshape aviation industry practices. Mandatory bias training became federal requirement, not corporate suggestion. Meal service protocols were standardized to prevent the kind of differential treatment Victoria had experienced. Disability accommodations were expanded and enforced with actual penalties for violations. And perhaps most importantly, a passenger bill of rights was codified into law, giving travelers real recourse when they experienced discrimination. But the changes went deeper than policy documents. Airlines began hiring chief diversity officers with actual authority and budgets. Flight attendant training programs were overhauled to emphasize dignity and equity alongside safety procedures. Mystery shopping programs were implemented to identify and addressed discriminatory behavior before it became viral incidents. And across the industry, the phrase "people like you" became synonymous with failure. A cautionary tale told in every training session, a reminder of what happened when prejudice was allowed to flourish unchecked. Bethany Walters, meanwhile, had discovered that cancellation in the social media age was swift, thorough, and merciless. Within a week of the video going viral, she'd been recognized at a grocery store in Phoenix, where she'd fled to stay with family. Someone had photographed her and posted it online with the caption, "Racist flight attendant spotted buying groceries like she didn't ruin someone's day." The post had received 17,000 shares. She'd deleted all her social media accounts, but screenshots of her previous posts had been archived and analyzed. A photo from 2 years earlier showing her at a Trump rally holding a sign that said "Build the Wall" was circulated widely. Comments she'd made on neighborhood Facebook groups complaining about those people moving into our neighborhood were compiled into damning threads. Her union had initially defended her, issuing a statement about due process and workers' rights. But when they'd reviewed the full documentation, including testimonies from 7 passengers and the complete audio/video recording, they'd quietly withdrawn their support. Even the most aggressive labor advocates couldn't defend deliberate discrimination. She'd applied to 47 different positions over 6 months, retail jobs, restaurant work, office administration. But every potential employer Googled her name, found the video, and declined to move forward. The phrase "people like you" had become an unshakable brand, a scarlet letter that followed her everywhere. In a strange twist, she'd eventually been contacted by a documentary filmmaker working on a project about public shaming and cancel culture. The filmmaker had offered her a chance to tell her side of the story, to express remorse, to perhaps begin the long process of rehabilitation. Bethany had declined, because even then, even after losing her career, her reputation, and her prospects, she couldn't bring herself to admit that what she'd done was wrong. She convinced herself she was the victim, that she'd been targeted unfairly, that a child had destroyed her life over nothing. Some people, it seems, would rather drown in their own bitterness than admit they were wrong. Harper Monroe turned 12 on a bright Sunday in June, surrounded by family and friends, in the backyard of their Charlotte home. The party was modest by Billionaire standards. No ponies, no celebrity performers, just a barbecue with burgers her uncle grilled and a homemade cake her grandmother baked. But there was one gift that stood out from all the others. Victoria had waited until the other guests had left, and the sun was setting in streaks of orange and gold across the sky. She'd led Harper into her study, a room Harper had rarely been allowed to enter, and closed the door behind them. "I have something for you," Victoria had said, her eyes still adjusting to the miracle of being able to see her daughter clearly after so many years of darkness. "It's not wrapped, and it's not exactly traditional." She'd handed Harper a leather portfolio embossed with gold lettering. Harper had opened it to find official documents, corporate papers, legal filings, transfer agreements. "Mom," Harper had said slowly, reading through the pages with growing comprehension, "these are—" "Shares in Monroe Holdings," Victoria had confirmed. 40% of the company. You're now a principal stakeholder, which means you have voting rights on major decisions, including the reformation and relaunch of Monroe Regional Airlines." Harper's head had snapped up. "You're rebuilding the airline?" "We're rebuilding the airline," Victoria had corrected. "You showed me something on that flight, sweetheart. You showed me that running away from pain doesn't heal it. You showed me that the best way to honor your father's memory isn't to abandon what we built together, but to make it better, to make it what it always should have been." She gestured to the documents. "Monroe Regional 2.0 launches in 8 months. We'll be a boutique carrier focusing on underserved regional routes. But more than that, We're going to be the model for what equitable, accessible aviation looks like. Every aircraft designed for full accessibility. Every crew member trained to the highest standards of anti-discrimination practice. Every passenger treated with absolute dignity, regardless of their ability to pay for first class. Harper's eyes had filled with tears. Daddy would love this. Your daddy believed that business could be a force for good, Victoria had said softly. He believed that profit and principles didn't have to be enemies. He used to say that the best companies weren't the ones that made the most money, but the ones that left the world better than they found it. She'd pulled Harper into a hug, feeling her daughter's tears soaking into her shoulder. You reminded me of that. When you stood up on that airplane and demanded respect, not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever been treated as less than. You showed me what courage actually looks like. And I decided I didn't want to be the kind of mother who teaches my daughter to be brave while I hide in the dark. They'd stood there for a long time, mother and daughter, holding each other as the sunset faded and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. I'm proud of you, Harper, Victoria had whispered. Not just for what you did on that flight, but for who you are, for your compassion and your strength and your refusal to accept that the world has to stay broken. I learned from the best, Harper had replied. The relaunch of Monroe Regional Airlines was announced at a press conference that drew national media attention. Victoria stood at a podium in the main terminal of Charlotte Douglas International Airport with Harper beside her and a new aircraft gleaming on the tarmac behind them. 4 years ago, Victoria had begun, her voice carrying across the crowd of reporters, investors, and industry observers. I walked away from this industry because I'd lost too much. I'd lost my husband. I'd lost my sight. And I'd lost faith that the business I loved could be anything more than profit margins and efficiency metrics. She'd paused, looking directly into the cameras. But my daughter taught me something. She taught me that you don't fix broken systems by abandoning them. You fix them by rebuilding them with intention and integrity. The presentation had detailed Monroe Regional's revolutionary approach. Aircraft equipped with enhanced accessibility features, tactile signage in Braille, induction loops for hearing-impaired passengers, and seats designed to accommodate a wider range of body types and mobility needs. The crew training program required 80 hours of anti-discrimination and cultural competency education. The hiring practices prioritized diversity not just in demographics, but in lived experience, actively recruiting people with disabilities, people from marginalized communities, people who understood what it meant to be treated as less than. We're not doing this because it's good marketing, Victoria had explained. We're doing this because it's right. Because every person who trusts us with their journey deserves to be treated with dignity. And because my daughter stood up on an airplane and demanded better, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let her down. The response had been overwhelming. Within the first week of accepting reservations, Monroe Regional had booked 70% capacity for their first 3 months of operation. Disability advocacy groups had praised the initiative as groundbreaking. Business analysts had called it either visionary or financial suicide, depending on their cynicism. But 6 months after the first flight took off, Monroe Regional's customer satisfaction scores were the highest in the industry. Their complaint rate was less than 1/10 of the industry average, and they were profitable. Not massively profitable, not private jet and yacht profitable, but sustainable, viable, proving that you could do business ethically and still succeed. And on every flight, in every first-class cabin, there was a small plaque mounted on the bulkhead. It read, "Dignity isn't a luxury, it's a right. Treat every passenger accordingly." Below that, in smaller letters, "In memory of Captain James Monroe, who believed aviation could change the world." Now, I need to ask you something. Think about the Monroes, a family that could have stayed quiet, could have accepted an apology and moved on. Instead, they chose to rebuild an entire industry's standards. If you had their resources and influence, what broken system would you try to fix? Share your answer below. 2 years after that confrontation in the sky, Harper Monroe stood before an auditorium packed with middle and high school students in Atlanta, Georgia. She was now 12 years old, but she carried herself with the poise of someone who'd learned early that age didn't determine authority, character did. The event was the National Youth Leadership Summit on Civil Rights, and Harper had been invited as the keynote speaker. The organizers had initially been skeptical about featuring someone so young, but after watching the viral video and reading about the changes that followed, they decided that Harper's voice was exactly what young people needed to hear. When I was 10 years old, Harper began, her voice clear and steady in the large space, I learned something important. I learned that sometimes the adults in the room are wrong. And when that happens, staying quiet doesn't keep you safe. It just lets the wrong continue. She paused, looking out at the sea of young faces, black, white, brown, Asian, all of them leaning forward, listening intently. I learned that respect isn't something you politely request. It's something you calmly demand. There's a difference. When you request something, you're asking permission. When you demand something, you're stating a requirement. And respect, dignity, those aren't privileges that adults get to grant or withhold based on how they feel about you. They're rights you possess simply by existing. In the front row, Victoria watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and awe that still, even after 2 years, brought tears to her eyes. This brilliant child, this fierce, compassionate, uncompromising soul, had saved her mother's life in ways that had nothing to do with meals or flight attendants. People asked me if I was scared that day on the airplane, Harper continued. Of course I was scared. I was 10 years old, standing, up to a grown woman who had all the visible power. She had the uniform. She had the authority of the airline behind her. She had 12 years of experience and the confidence that comes from being an adult in a world that tells children to sit down and be quiet. She let that sink in for a moment. But I had something stronger than visible power. I had moral clarity. I knew what had happened was wrong. I knew my mother deserved better. I knew that every person who looked like us deserved better. And I knew that if I stayed silent, I'd be teaching myself that injustice is acceptable when it's inconvenient to fight it. The auditorium was absolutely still. You could have heard a whisper from the back row. So here's what I want you to understand, Harper said, her voice growing stronger. Your voice matters, not someday when you're older, not when you have money or degrees or whatever arbitrary marker of maturity society says you need. Right now. Today, your voice matters because you matter. She gestured to the audience. I see you. I see the kid in the third row who's being bullied because of their accent. I see the girl in the back who's being told she's too loud, too opinionated, too much. I see the young man in the middle who's being followed in stores because people make assumptions about what he might steal based on how he looks. I see all of you because I am you. Harper's voice softened slightly, becoming more intimate despite the large crowd. And I want you to know something else. Standing up doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like quietly refusing to accept disrespect. Sometimes it looks like documenting what happened and reporting it through proper channels. Sometimes it looks like building something better to replace what's broken. She glanced at her mother. My mom could have sued the airline. She could have pursued legal action that would have cost them millions. But instead, she chose to rebuild, to create something better, to prove that the alternative to broken systems isn't destruction, it's transformation. The applause started slowly, then built to a crescendo that shook the walls. After the speech, a line of students formed to speak with Harper. Some wanted advice. Some wanted to share their own stories of standing up. Some just wanted to shake her hand and say thank you. But one conversation stood out. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, approached nervously. She had neat cornrows decorated with colorful beads, and she wore a dress that looked like someone's Sunday best. "Ms. Harper," the girl said shyly, "my name is Faith. My teacher says I should always be polite and respectful and not make trouble. But sometimes kids say mean things about my hair, and I don't know what to do." Harper knelt down to Faith's eye level, remembering her own confusion at that age about when to fight and when to let things go. "What do you want to do when they say those things?" Harper asked, gently. "I want to tell them to stop. I want to say my hair is beautiful and they're wrong. But my teacher says that's being rude." Harper took the girl's hands in hers. "Faith, listen to me carefully. There's a difference between being rude and standing up for yourself. Being rude is attacking someone who hasn't done anything wrong. Standing up for yourself is protecting your dignity when someone tries to take it away. And you know what? Sometimes adults get confused about which is which." Faith's eyes were wide. "Really? Really? You can be polite and still defend yourself. You can be respectful and still demand respect back. Those aren't opposites. In fact, the most powerful thing you can do is stay calm and clear when you're standing up for yourself. That's what makes people listen." "Like what you did on the airplane?" "Exactly like that. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't call the flight attendant names. I just clearly stated what was wrong and what needed to change, and that made it hard for people to dismiss me." Faith nodded slowly, processing this. "What should I say the next time someone makes fun of my hair?" Harper thought for a moment. "You could say, 'My hair is part of my culture and my identity. When you insult it, you're insulting me. I'm asking you politely to stop, but I'm not asking if it's okay to feel hurt. It's not okay. Can you remember that?'" Faith repeated the words carefully, committing them to memory. Then she threw her arms around Harper in a fierce hug. "Thank you," she whispered. Harper hugged her back, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with being a role model. "You're going to be amazing, Faith. Don't let anyone make you small." That evening, as Victoria and Harper flew home on one of their own Monroe regional flights, they reflected on how much had changed since that terrible day on Skyline Airways. "Do you ever think about her?" Victoria asked, the question that had become almost ritual between and them. "The flight attendant?" Harper looked out the window at the clouds painted gold by the setting sun. Her answer had evolved over the years, deepened by experience and the wisdom that comes from seeing consequences unfold. "I think about her sometimes," Harper said thoughtfully. "I wonder if she ever understood why what she did was wrong. I wonder if she learned anything. I hope she did, because carrying that much hate must be exhausting." She turned to face her mother. "But I also think about all the people who were watching, all the passengers who saw what happened and maybe thought about their own behaviors differently afterward. All the airline employees who saw the video and decided to be more conscious of their biases. All the kids who saw that a 10-year-old could stand up to an adult and win." Victoria reached for her daughter's hand. "You changed more than just one flight attendant's career. You know that, right?" "I know," Harper said quietly. "But that's the thing about standing up. You never know how far the ripples will spread. You just have to trust that doing the right thing matters, even if you can't see all the effects." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the world pass beneath them at 500 miles per hour. "Mom," Harper said eventually, "can I ask you something?" "Anything, sweetheart." "When you were building the first airline, before I was born, did you ever think about giving up? Did you ever want to walk away when things got hard?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment, memories flooding back. The endless nights working on business plans, the banks that refused to loan to a black woman entrepreneur, the industry veterans who dismissed her ideas as naive, the constant pressure to prove herself twice as capable to receive half the credit. "Every single day," she admitted. "But your father wouldn't let me quit. He used to say, 'The world doesn't change because comfortable people make safe choices. It changes because uncomfortable people make brave ones.'" Harper smiled at that. "Daddy was smart." "Your daddy was the bravest person I ever knew," Victoria said softly. "Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he was afraid and did the right thing anyway. And you're exactly like him." "I hope so," Harper whispered. They landed in Charlotte as the last light was fading from the sky. As they disembarked, walking through the terminal that Victoria now saw clearly, every detail sharp and vivid, they passed a group of teenagers who recognized Harper from her speech. "That's her," one whispered to the others. "That's the girl from the airplane video." Harper smiled and waved. The teenagers waved back, shy but excited. And in that moment, Victoria understood something profound. Her daughter hadn't just stood up to a racist flight attendant. She hadn't just sparked industry reform or become a viral sensation or inspired legislative change. She'd become a symbol, a reminder that courage doesn't have an age requirement, that justice doesn't wait for permission, that sometimes the most important voices are the ones society most expects to stay silent. 3 years after the incident, the FAA issued its final report on discrimination in commercial aviation. The document ran to 374 pages, but its core findings could be summarized simply. Systemic change was possible, but only with sustained commitment from every level of the industry. The report cited Monroe Regional Airlines as the gold standard, noting that their complaint rate was 92% lower than the industry average, while their profitability remained competitive. They recommended that Monroe's training protocols be adapted industry-wide. Victoria was asked to testify before Congress about the reforms. She stood before the Senate Commerce Committee with Harper beside her and delivered testimony that would be quoted in business schools and civil rights courses for years to come. "Change doesn't happen because we wish for it," Victoria had said, looking directly at the senators. "It happens because we demand it, measure it, and hold each other accountable for it. My daughter taught me that lesson when she was 10 years old. And if a 10-year-old can understand that principles aren't negotiable, then surely we as a society can rise to that same standard." The testimony was compelling. The reforms were comprehensive. But perhaps most importantly, the culture began to shift. Flight attendants who witnessed discrimination were empowered to report it without fear of retaliation. Passengers who experienced bias had clear reporting channels with actual follow-through. And airlines that failed to address systemic problems faced real consequences, not just bad publicity, but federal penalties and public oversight. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice doesn't disappear with policy changes. But it was better, measurably, documentably better. And whenever anyone asked, "Victoria, what had made the difference?" she had the same answer. A child who refused to accept that dignity was negotiable. A child who understood that sometimes you have to fight, even when the odds seem impossible. A child who reminded me that the best way to honor loss isn't to hide from the world, it's to make the world better. On a crisp October morning 5 years after the incident, Harper Monroe, now 15 years old, boarded a Monroe regional flight from Charlotte to Boston, where she'd been invited to speak at MIT about ethical leadership in business. She settled into her first-class seat and pulled out a book on systems thinking and organizational change. The flight attendant who greeted her was a young woman named Jasmine, who smiled warmly as she helped Harper stow her bag. "Is there anything I can get you before we take off?" Jasmine asked. "Just water, please," Harper replied. "Thank you." As Jasmine walked away to get the water, Harper noticed her pause to help an elderly passenger with mobility issues, taking extra time to ensure he was comfortable and had everything he needed. She noticed the Braille menus available at every seat. She noticed the visual and audio announcements made in multiple languages. She noticed the wheelchair-accessible lavatory clearly marked near the front of the cabin. She noticed all the small details that added up to dignity. When Jasmine returned with the water, Harper caught her eye. "You're really good at this," she said. "The service, I mean. The way you made that passenger feel cared for." Jasmine's smile widened. "Thank you. I trained with Monroe Regional's program. They taught us that service isn't about efficiency. It's about humanity. Every passenger has a story. Every journey matters. Our job is to honor that." Harper felt warmth spread through her chest. That's exactly right. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Harper looked out the window at the other aircraft lined up on the tarmac. Some were Monroe Regional planes, but most belonged to other carriers. And she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction knowing that many of those other carriers had adopted Monroe's standards because the old way of doing business, the way that allowed people to be treated as less than, was no longer acceptable. The change hadn't been easy. It hadn't been quick. It hadn't been complete. But it was real. And it had started with a 10-year-old girl refusing to accept that her blind mother deserved rotten food and disrespect. The plane lifted off, leaving Charlotte behind and climbing into the morning sky. Harper watched the city shrink beneath them, thinking about all the fights still to come, because injustice was persistent and required constant vigilance, but also about all the progress that had been made. She thought about Faith, the little girl from the youth summit, who'd recently sent her a letter describing how she'd stood up to bullies at school using the words Harper had taught her. She thought about the dozens of other children who'd reached out over the years, sharing their own stories of finding courage in unexpected moments. She thought about her father, who she'd never stopped missing, but whose values lived on in everything she did. And she thought about her mother, who'd turned profound loss into powerful transformation, who'd shown that strength isn't about never falling, it's about choosing to rise. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Harper opened her book. But before she started reading, she pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to her mother. "On the plane to Boston, everything's perfect. The crew is amazing. You built something beautiful, Mom. Daddy would be so proud." The response came quickly. "Baby, your daddy would have stood up and cheered for you every single day. I love you. Knock 'em dead in Boston." Harper smiled and settled back in her seat, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Because she'd learned early that some fights are worth having, that some lines cannot be crossed without consequences, that dignity isn't a luxury reserved for those who can afford first class. It's a fundamental right that belongs to every human being. And that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Here's what I need you to understand as we close this story. The confrontation on that Skyline Airways flight wasn't just about one racist flight attendant or one spoiled meal. It was about a moment when someone said enough, when a child looked at injustice and refused to normalize it, when a mother found the courage to emerge from grief and rebuild what had been broken. It was about the choice we all face when we witness wrong. Stay silent and complicit, or speak up and accept the discomfort that comes with demanding better. Harper Monroe chose to speak, and her voice echoed far beyond that first-class cabin. It echoed in the congressional hearings that reformed aviation policy. It echoed in the training programs that taught a new generation of airline employees about dignity and respect. It echoed in the children who saw her example and learned that age doesn't determine authority. Character does. It echoed in the rebuilt airline that proved you could prioritize people and still succeed. And it echoes still, wherever people refuse to accept that injustice is just the way things are. The story of Harper and Victoria Monroe reminds us that change is possible, that courage doesn't require perfection, just persistence, that standing up for what's right matters, even when the odds seem impossible, and that sometimes the most transformative acts of resistance come not from anger or violence, but from a calm, clear voice saying, "This is wrong, and it needs to change." In a world that often feels overwhelming, that tells us problems are too big to solve and systems too entrenched to change, remember this: a 10-year-old girl changed OEM's entire industry because she refused to accept that her mother deserved less than dignity. If she could do that, imagine what we could accomplish if we all found that same courage. Before you go, I want to hear from you. This story moved people across the country, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. It showed that even when the world tries to silence you, your voice has power. Subscribe to Justice Stories if you believe these stories need to be told. Give this video a like if Harper's courage inspired you. And drop a comment sharing your thoughts on this entire journey. What stood out to you most? Was it Harper's composure, Victoria's transformation, the industry changes that followed? I want to know what part of this story is going to stay with you long after you've finished watching. Share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that standing up for dignity, for yourself and for others, is never a wasted effort. Because the ripples from one act of courage can spread farther than we ever imagine. Thank you for watching Justice Stories. Stay courageous, stay kind, and never accept that respect is anything less than a fundamental right.